phone rang at 7:22 a.m. on January 15th, 1974, piercing through the winter quiet of the Wichita Police Department. Detective Bernie Drotsky lifted the receiver to hear Mrs. Henderson's trembling voice reporting that something terrible had happened at the Otero house on Edgemore Street. She'd been walking her dog when she noticed the family's car still in the driveway, well past the time Joseph Otero usually left for work at Coleman Company. The front door stood slightly ajar, swaying in the bitter Kansas wind like an invitation to horror. When officers arrived at the modest ranch-style home, they discovered a scene that would haunt the Prairie City for the next 3 decades and beyond. Joseph Otero, 38, lay bound with Venetian blind cord in the master bedroom, his body twisted in the final moments of a struggle that had ended in strangulation. His wife Julie, 34, had been found in the same room, similarly bound and strangled, her dark hair splayed across the carpet where she had fallen. But the true depths of the killer's depravity revealed themselves in the hallway, where 11-year-old Josephine hung from a pipe in the basement, and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. lay suffocated in his bedroom, plastic wrapped around his small head. The house felt heavy with death, every room seeming to whisper of the terror that had unfolded within its walls just hours before. Crime scene photographer James Webb would later say he'd never seen anything like it in 20 years on the force. The way each victim had been carefully positioned, almost posed, as if the killer had taken time to arrange his macabre tableau. What investigators didn't yet know was that somewhere in Wichita, a man was savoring every detail of their horror, reading newspaper accounts with the same satisfaction others might reserve for a favorite novel. The killer had already chosen his signature, though law enforcement wouldn't learn of it for months to come. BTK, bind, torture, kill. The 3 words that would define a reign of terror stretching across decades, transforming a quiet Midwestern city into a landscape of locked doors, drawn curtains, and parents who checked their children's rooms twice before sleep. The man responsible watched the investigation unfold with keen interest, already planning his next move while Wichita mourned its dead. 3 months after the Otero murders, Detective Drotsky received another call that made his blood run cold. Catherine Bright, 21, had been discovered shot and stabbed in her home on South Hillside, while her brother Kevin had somehow survived multiple gunshot wounds despite the killer's apparent intention to leave no witnesses. The young man's testimony painted a chilling picture of a methodical predator who had entered their home with tools and plans, someone who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the fear he inflicted. Kevin described a man of average height and build, soft-spoken yet commanding, who had moved through their house with the confidence of someone who had done this before. The survivors' accounts suggested they were dealing with someone who was organized, patient, and utterly without mercy. The first letter arrived at Kachi TV on October 22, 1974, typed on what appeared to be a school typewriter, the kind found in offices and institutions across the city. The envelope bore no return address, but inside lay a confession that would chill every reader to the bone. I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer, as well as your time. Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself, and with no one's help. There has been no talk either. Let's put it straight. The letter went on to describe details of the crime that only the killer could have known, details that had been carefully withheld from public knowledge. But it was the signature that truly terrified investigators. BTK. The killer wasn't finished. He was just getting started, and he wanted everyone to know it. Years passed like a slow-burning fuse, each season bringing fresh anxiety to the residents of Wichita. The killer seemed to vanish into the fabric of the community, becoming a ghost that haunted coffee shop conversations and neighborhood watch meetings. Parents developed elaborate security rituals, checking locks multiple times, and establishing code words with their children. The Wichita Police Department created a special task force dedicated to BTK, but leads dried up like wheat fields in summer drought. Then, on April 4, 1979, the nightmare resumed with devastating clarity. 63-year-old Anna Williams had plans to attend a family gathering that evening, But BTK had been watching her routine for weeks, noting when she left and when she returned, learning the rhythm of her solitary life in the house on South Seneca. The killer had broken into William's home and waited in the darkness, but his intended victim never returned. Frustrated by the missed opportunity, the predator ransacked her belongings and stole items that seemed to hold no monetary value but carried deep personal significance. What investigators discovered later was far more disturbing than simple theft. The man had spent hours in the house, going through family photographs, personal papers, even trying on her clothes in what appeared to be some twisted fantasy fulfillment. He had left behind evidence of his presence everywhere: fingerprints on picture frames, footprints in the garden soil, and most chillingly, a poem scrawled on her bathroom mirror in what appeared to be lipstick, describing in crude verse what he had planned to do to her. 3 years later, Nancy Fox would not be so fortunate. The 25-year-old secretary lived alone in a small apartment on South Pershing, working late shifts at H&R Block during tax season. On December 8, 1977, she returned home to find a figure waiting in her kitchen, someone who had spent the afternoon learning the layout of her apartment and deciding exactly how the evening would unfold. Fox was found the next morning by a concerned co-worker, strangled with her own pantyhose, posed in a manner that suggested the killer had spent considerable time with the body after death. The crime scene revealed disturbing evidence of the killer's growing confidence and ritualistic behavior. He had removed the phone from the wall, ensuring no calls for help could be made, but then had taken the time to make himself a sandwich from her refrigerator, eating it while sitting at her kitchen table as if he belonged there. What truly unnerved investigators was the call that came into the police department hours after Fox's body was discovered. A calm, pleasant voice directed them to go to 843 South Pershing. You will find a homicide. The caller hung up before questions could be asked, but the recording would be analyzed for years, played back countless times as investigators tried to match the voice to a face, to find some trace of accent or speech pattern that might narrow their search. The man sounded educated, perhaps middle-aged, with the kind of voice that might ask about your weekend plans at the grocery store checkout. This ordinary quality made him all the more terrifying. BTK was hiding in plain sight, moving through Wichita like any other resident while planning his next attack. The 1980s brought a different kind of torment for the community. The murders stopped, but the fear remained, settling over neighborhoods like morning fog that never quite burned away. Residents began to wonder if the killer had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for another crime. Some dared to hope the nightmare had ended, while others suspected BTK was simply waiting, biding his time like a patient spider in an unseen web. The police maintained their task force, but resources grew thin as other cases demanded attention and the trail grew colder with each passing month. Detective Bernie Drabatsky retired without ever solving the case that had defined his career, passing the torch to younger investigators, who carried the weight of all those unsolved murders and the community's desperate need for answers. But BTK was very much alive, living a life of careful normalcy that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He had taken a job with ADT Security Services, installing security systems in the very homes where terrified residents hoped to find protection from monsters like himself. The irony was not lost on the killer, who took perverse pleasure in reassuring frightened customers about their safety while knowing he was the very threat they sought to guard against. During the day, he was punctual, reliable, even helpful to elderly clients who needed extra time to understand their new alarm system. He attended church regularly, sang in the choir with a voice that neighbors described as surprisingly pleasant, and seemed to genuinely care about his community involved. This carefully constructed facade allowed him to move freely through Wichita, studying potential victims, learning their routines, and feeding the dark hunger that never quite left him satisfied. The marriage to Paula Dietz in 1971 had provided additional cover for his double life. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like an ordinary couple raising their children in a quiet suburb, attending school functions and neighborhood barbecues with the same regularity as any other family. Paula worked as a secretary at the VA hospital while Dennis maintained steady employment and pursued compliance work that suited his methodical nature. Their children, Kerry and Brian, grew up believing their father was simply a stern but devoted parent
who insisted on strict household rules and predictable routine. They had no way of knowing that their father's obsession with control extended far beyond family discipline into something infinitely darker and more dangerous.
Throughout the silent years, BTK refined his methods and expanded his fantasies. He kept detailed records of potential victims, photographing houses, and taking notes on residence schedules. With the dedication of a scholar studying for comprehensive exams, he created elaborate scenarios in his mind, sometimes acting them out in empty buildings or abandoned properties where he could explore his violent impulses without risk of discovery. The killer developed a sophisticated understanding of police procedures and forensic techniques, partly through his work installing security systems, and partly through obsessive study of criminal investigation methods. He knew how evidence was collected and processed, which made him increasingly careful about leaving traces that might lead back to him. The resurrection of BTK's killing spree began with Vicky Wegerle on September 16. The 28-year-old mother was home alone with her infant son when the killer knocked on her door, posing as a telephone repairman, investigating line problems in the neighborhood. His presentation was so convincing, his manner so professional, that Wegerle allowed him entry without hesitation. The man who entered her home that afternoon had spent years perfecting his approach, learning to project trustworthiness while concealing the predator beneath. Wegerle was found hours later by her husband Bill, strangled with her own pantyhose in the bedroom, while their baby cried in his crib, unharmed, but serving as the sole witness to his mother's final moments. The crime scene revealed BTK's evolution as a killer. He had become more careful about physical evidence, wearing gloves throughout the attack, and taking items that seemed chosen for their personal significance rather than monetary value. Photographs from Wegerle's purse were missing, along with her driver's license and other identification that served no practical purpose for robbery. The killer appeared to be collecting trophies, mementos that would allow him to relive the experience long after the victim was dead. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence suggesting he had spent considerable time in the house after the murder, moving through rooms and examining family belongings with the leisurely attitude of an invited guest rather than an intruder who needed to escape quickly. Dolores Davis, 62, became BTK's final victim on January 19. The grandmother lived alone in a trailer park on the outskirts of Wichita, maintaining an independent lifestyle despite her children's concerns about her safety. Davis had recently started dating again after years of widowhood, finding companionship with a gentleman from her church who brought her flowers and took us to dinner at modest restaurants she enjoyed. Her murder seemed different from the others initially, more random and opportunistic, until forensic analysis revealed the same methodical approach and careful staging that had become BTK's trademark. The killer had grown more cautious with age, but his fundamental need to control and dominate remained unchanged, driving him to take increasingly calculated risks. For 13 years after Davis's murder, BTK vanished again into the community like smoke dissipating in prairie wind. Police received occasional tips and false confessions, but nothing substantial enough to revive the investigation. The task force was reduced to a single detective, and many residents began to assume the killer had died or moved away permanently. Children who had grown up during BTK's active years became adults themselves, sometimes joking darkly about the bogeyman of their youth, while secretly checking locks and avoiding walks after dark. The case became part of Wichita's collective memory, a shared trauma that connected neighbors who had lived through those frightening decades when no one felt truly safe. But BTK was watching and waiting, following news coverage of cold case investigations, and growing increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as inadequate recognition of his crime. The killer had always craved attention and acknowledgement, viewing his murders as artistic statements that deserved serious analysis rather than simply being filed away as unsolved cases. He began to feel forgotten, eclipsed by other serial killers who had achieved greater notoriety despite what he considered his superior planning and execution. This wounded pride would ultimately prove to be his undoing,
driving him to break the silence that had protected him for so many years. The resurrection began in March 2004 when the Wichita Eagle received a package containing disturbing photographs and a driver's license that had been missing since Vicky Wegler's murder 18 years earlier. The envelope bore no return address, but the contents made the sender's identity unmistakable to investigators who had spent decades studying BTK's method. The photographs showed Wegler's body positioned exactly as police had found it, taken from angles that could only have been captured by the killer himself. Along with the images came a letter typed in the same style as the 1974 communications, with identical grammar quirks and word choices that served as a fingerprint more reliable than any physical evidence. The media explosion that followed exceeded even BTK's expectations for attention. News trucks lined the streets around police headquarters, while reporters from national networks arrived to cover the resurrection of America's most patient serial killer. The story dominated headlines for weeks, with criminal profilers appearing on television to speculate about the killer's motives for breaking his long silence. BTK watched this coverage with satisfaction, finally receiving what he considered appropriate recognition for his criminal accomplishment. But the attention also fed his ego in dangerous ways, encouraging him to continue communicating with authorities and media outlets in increasingly risky ways. Detective Ken Landwehr had been assigned to the BTK task force just months before the 2004 letter arrived, inheriting boxes of evidence and witness statements that represented 3 decades of frustrated investigation. The sergeant was known for his methodical approach and refusal to give up on difficult cases, qualities that would prove essential in the psychological chess match about to unfold. Landwehr understood that BTK's return to communication represented both an opportunity and a danger. The killer's need for attention might lead him to make mistakes, but it also meant he was actively engaged in the case again, possibly planning new attacks after years of dormancy. The dance between killer and detective intensified over the following months, as BTK sent a series of communications to various media outlets and police departments. Each package contained carefully curated evidence of past crimes, along with taunting messages that revealed the sender's intimate knowledge of investigation procedures and forensic technique. The killer seemed to view the correspondence as a game, challenging investigators to match his intelligence, while subtly boasting about crimes they had never connected to. He referenced unsolved cases and hinted at victims whose names had never appeared in BTK files, suggesting his actual body count might be higher than anyone had suspected. One communication contained jewelry that had belonged to murder victims, pieces that family members identified with certainty despite the passage of years. Another included drawings that appeared to depict bound victims in various poses, sketched with the mechanical precision of someone trained in technical drafting. The killer's artistic pretensions became increasingly evident, as he included poetry and crude philosophical musings about the nature of death and control. These writings revealed a mind that had spent years developing elaborate justifications for murder, creating a personal mythology that cast him as something more significant than a common criminal. The breakthrough came through technology that hadn't existed during BTK's early crime. Detective Landwehr had been carefully nurturing the killer's ego through strategic media releases, publicly acknowledging his intelligence, while subtly challenging him to prove his superiority. When BTK asked whether communications sent via floppy disk could be traced, the detective made a calculated decision to lie, assuring the killer through newspaper interviews that electronic communications would be safe from investigation. This deception played on BTK's arrogance and his outdated understanding of digital forensics, technologies that had advanced considerably during his years of silence. On February 16, 2005, a purple floppy disk arrived at KSA containing a deleted Microsoft Word document that would finally unmask America's most patient serial killer. Computer forensic specialist Randy Stone recovered metadata that revealed the document had been created by someone named Dennis on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, a small suburb north of Wichita. The trail led investigators to Dennis Lynn Rader, a 59-year-old compliance officer for Park City, who served as president of the church congregation and had lived in the area throughout BTK's active years. The surveillance that followed revealed a man whose public persona seemed completely incompatible with the monster investigators had been hunted. Rader attended church services regularly, led Boy Scout troops, and maintained an impeccable reputation among neighbors who considered him helpful if somewhat rigid in his expectation. He had served as a census taker, park ranger, and installation specialist for security systems, jobs that provided legitimate reasons to enter homes and observe residents' routine. The killer had hidden in plain sight for 30 years, using his reputation for reliability and civic responsibility as camouflage for activities that would have horrified anyone who truly knew him. DNA evidence collected from crime scenes and compared to samples taken from Rader's discarded coffee cup and cigarette butts provided final confirmation of what investigators already knew. The genetic material that had been carefully preserved for decades finally had a match, connecting Dennis Rader definitively to murders spanning nearly 2 decades. The science that hadn't existed when BTK began killing had finally caught up with him, providing irrefutable proof that would eliminate any possibility of mistaken identity or false confession.
The arrest came on February 25, 2005, as Rader drove home from his job at City Hall, where he had been issuing citations for municipal violations with the same attention to detail he had once applied to planning murders. Police vehicles surrounded his car in broad daylight, transforming an ordinary Friday afternoon into the conclusion of one of America's longest-running murder investigations. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the man they had known for years was handcuffed and led away, many struggling to reconcile the helpful citizen they remembered with the monster described in news reports that would soon flood television screens and newspaper front pages. Inside Rader's home, investigators discovered a treasure trove of evidence that painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had spent decades living parallel lives with remarkable success. Hidden throughout the house were hundreds of photographs, detailed drawings, and written fantasies depicting bound victims in various scenarios. Some images showed actual crime scenes, while others appeared to be rehearsals or fantasies involving mannequins and dolls. The killer had maintained meticulous records of his crimes, including maps of victims' neighborhoods and schedules of their daily routines. In a locked filing cabinet, police found jewelry and identification cards taken from murder scenes, preserved like sacred relics in plastic bags, labeled with dates and victim names. Perhaps most chilling were the hundreds of self-portraits BTK had taken over the years, photographs showing him bound and posed in the same positions he had forced upon his victims. These images revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance, suggesting that the killer identified not just with the power of the murderer, but also with the helplessness of the victim. The photographs spanned decades, showing Rader aging from a young man into middle age, while maintaining the same disturbing rituals in basements, abandoned buildings, and hotel rooms where he could indulge his fantasies without risk of discovery by family members. The community struggled to process the revelation that their tormentor had been living among them all along, attending the same grocery stores, sitting in adjacent pews at church services, even participating in neighborhood watch meetings, organized in response to his own crime. Parents realized their children had played with BTK's children, had attended birthday parties and school events where they had unknowingly shared space with one of America's most notorious serial killers. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for many residents, who had to reconcile years of fear with the knowledge that the source of that terror had been hiding behind a mask of middle-class respectability. Paula Rader's discovery of her husband's true nature became one of the case's most tragic elements. The woman who had shared a bed with BTK for 34 years, who had raised children with him and planned for retirement together, had to confront the incomprehensible reality that the man she thought she knew was responsible for decades of community terror. Friends and family members struggled to find signs they had missed, moments when the mask had slipped to reveal the monster beneath.
but Rader had been extraordinarily skilled at compartmentalizing his violent impulses and presenting a completely conventional exterior to those closest to him. The confession that followed Rader's arrest revealed details that had haunted investigators for 3 decades and answered questions that had seemed destined to remain mysteries forever. Speaking in the same calm, methodical voice that witnesses had described, the killer walked detectives through each murder with tactical precision, describing his methods, his selection criteria, and his emotional state during the attack. He discussed binding techniques with the enthusiasm of a craftsman describing his trade, explaining how he had refined his approach over time to maximize both victim suffering and his own satisfaction. The sessions were recorded for posterity, creating an audio record of evil that criminologists would study for years in their attempts to understand the psychology of serial murder. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of a man driven by fantasies that had begun in childhood and gradually escalated into reality. Rader described early experiences of sexual arousal connected to images of bound victims, fantasies that had grown more elaborate and specific over time, until mere imagination could no longer satisfy his need. He spoke of his crimes as if they were career achievements, displaying pride in his ability to evade capture while maintaining a normal family life and professional reputation. The killer seemed genuinely surprised by the horror his confession provoked, viewing his murders as natural expressions of his personality rather than acts of unthinkable cruelty. The trial that followed provided closure for some family members while opening new wounds for others. Victim impact statements painted heartbreaking portraits of lives cut short and families destroyed by BTK's need for control and domination. Julie Otero's brother described how the murders had fractured their extended family, creating years of suspicion and fear that had damaged relationships and trust in ways that persisted long after the initial grief had evolved into something more manageable. Kevin Bright, the sole survivor of BTK's attacks, testified about decades of survivor's guilt and the challenge of building a normal life while carrying memories of his sister's murder and his own narrow escape from death. Rader's sentencing hearing on August 18. The proceedings revealed the killer's complete lack of empathy or remorse as he listened to descriptions of the devastation he had caused with the same detached interest he might show during a municipal planning meeting. When given opportunities to express regret or explain his actions, Rader instead offered technical clarifications about his methods and timeline, treating the hearing like an academic conference where he was the featured expert on his own crime. The 10 consecutive life sentences imposed by Judge Greg Waller ensured that BTK would die in prison, but the psychological damage inflicted on Wichita would persist for generations. The case fundamentally changed how residents viewed their community and their neighbors, introducing a permanent element of suspicion and weariness that had not existed before. Children who had grown up during BTK's active years carried trauma into their adult lives, passing anxiety and hypervigilance to their own children who had never experienced the terror firsthand, but inherited its emotional residue through family stories and community memory. The investigation's conclusion also revealed troubling questions about how many other Dennis Raders might be living similar double lives in communities across America. Profilers who studied the case noted that BTK's ability to maintain normal relationships and professional success while committing horrific murders suggested a level of psychological compartmentalization that might be more common than law enforcement had previously assumed. The killer's use of legitimate employment as cover for criminal behavior, his participation in community organizations, and his success at avoiding suspicion for 3 decades provided a troubling blueprint for how predators might hide among trusted members of society. Today, more than 2 decades after his arrest, Dennis Rader remains imprisoned at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he spends his days in relative isolation, while maintaining correspondence with criminal researchers and journalists fascinated by his case. Prison officials report that he continues to show no genuine remorse for his crimes, instead treating his notoriety as vindication of his superior intelligence and criminal sophistication. He has written extensively about his methods and motivations, creating a disturbing archive that provides insight into the mind of a serial killer, while raising ethical questions about giving platforms to murderers who crave attention and recognition. The BTK case serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces and hides behind masks of respectability that can fool even those closest to the perpetrator. Dennis Rader's 30-year reign of terror demonstrates how patient and methodical killers can evade capture by understanding and exploiting the limitations of investigative techniques while maintaining public personas that deflect suspicion and scrutiny. His ability to compartmentalize his violent impulses while functioning as a husband, father, and community member challenges comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil and the reliability of our ability to recognize dangerous individuals before they act on their darkest impulse. The families of BTK's victims continue to struggle with questions that may never have satisfactory answers. How could someone appear so normal while harboring such darkness? Why did he choose their loved ones from among all possible victims? And what might have been different if investigators had connected the dots sooner, or if neighbors had paid attention to signs that now seem obvious in retrospect? These questions echo through the quiet streets of Wichita, where residents still lock their doors a little more carefully and look twice at strangers who seem too interested in their daily routine. The BTK murders remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to exploit our basic human tendency to trust appearances and accept people at face value. Dennis Rader succeeded for 3 decades, not because he was extraordinarily clever, but because he understood that ordinary evil could hide indefinitely behind a mask of conventional respectability, waiting patiently for the right moment to satisfy desires too dark for civilized society to acknowledge or understand. His story serves as a permanent warning about the monsters who might be watching and waiting from behind the facades of our most trusted institutions and familiar faces.